Imagine for a second that the monsters hunting you in your darkest nightmares, the ancient gods that civilizations built entire empires to worship, and even the characters in every myth, legend, or blockbuster movie ever told. What if they were all the exact same entities? And I don't mean that as some poetic metaphor. I don't mean it's a grand historical coincidence. What if they are living, dynamic, biological structures operating inside your mind right now? I know. That sounds like the opening premise of a sci-fi novel. But what we're actually talking about is the foundation of one of the most profound, and honestly, one of the most arguably terrifying psychological frameworks ever developed. We're talking about literal forces that dictate human behavior entirely behind the scenes, which is exactly why we're taking a massive deep dive into this today. We're looking at Carl Jung's theory of archetypes and the collective unconscious. And to do this properly, we've pulled together a serious stack of sources, excerpts directly from Jung's collected works, clinical structural dream analysis, and modern studies on evolutionary neurotheology. Studies that test these century-old ideas against modern brain science, because this needs to be unpacked properly. If you spend any time on the internet, you see Jung's work reduced to buzzwords. People treat archetypes like a personality quiz. Find out which mythological character you are. Or they treat it like a catalogue of spooky symbols, and that completely, utterly misses the point. So consider this our mission today, to rescue a truly radical, actually dangerous concept from the grip of pop psychology misconceptions. Let's start by throwing out the way most people summarize Jung, because the typical portrait paints him as some mystical armchair philosopher. But the sources tell a very different story. To understand what an archetype truly is, we have to start with the real-world problem Jung was desperately trying to solve. Jung wasn't theorizing in a vacuum. He was a psychiatrist working in the trenches. In the early 1900s, he was at the Burgholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, treating severely psychotic patients. Intense delusions, schizophrenic states, hallucinations. He was observing minds that had completely fractured, and in that state, he saw a pattern that should have been totally impossible. Picture a patient who has lived their entire life in a small rural European town, ordinary background, very limited education, never studied ancient history, never read esoteric religious texts. Yet in the depths of their psychosis, this patient begins hallucinating and obsessively drawing highly complex, incredibly specific mythological motifs. Our sources highlight one of the most famous clinical examples of this, the solar phallus man, and when I first read this case study, it genuinely felt like reading a ghost story. Jung had a patient, a man in his 30s suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. One day, Jung finds this man standing at a window, staring directly at the sun. The patient calls Jung over and says, "Look at the sun. Do you see the tube hanging down from it? When I move my head, the tube moves. And that is what creates the wind." On the surface, that sounds like a tragic, schizophrenic hallucination. But years later, a book was published, a brand new first-time translation of an ancient Greek papyrus. And in that papyrus, detailing a mythic religious liturgy, there it was. A vision of a tube hanging down from the sun, described as the origin of the ministering wind. Let that sink in for a moment. A modern, uneducated patient describes an incredibly bizarre, highly specific physical mechanism. And then years later, a translation of a 2,000-year-old secret religious cult text reveals the exact same image. Jung called these instances autochthonous revivals, from the Greek meaning springing directly from the earth. In psychological terms, it means a thought or image that arises completely independently of any outside influence. The patient didn't read it in a book, didn't hear it in a lecture. Their mind organically manufactured a 2,000-year-old religious motif completely from scratch. To put that in modern terms, it would be like locking a child in a blank room for their entire life, and at age 20, they suddenly draw a perfect, scaled blueprint of the Apollo 11 lunar lander. It defies everything we understand about how the human mind acquires information. And that impossible phenomenon is what completely shattered the existing model of the human mind. Because at that time, the undisputed king of psychology was Sigmund Freud, and Jung was Freud's protege, but this patient drove a wedge between them. Freud viewed the human psyche through a biological, mechanistic lens. For him, the unconscious mind was essentially a personal storage vault, a dark basement, where the conscious mind shoved its repressed childhood traumas and unacceptable social desires. In Freud's world, the unconscious is a landfill of your own personal lifetime experiences. If you have a neurosis or a hallucination, Freud would trace it back to something that happened to you when you were 3 years old. His model was entirely personalistic. But Jung looked at the solar phallus patient and realized Freud's model was simply too small to hold the data. Freud would have argued the patient was repressing a childhood trauma. But Jung pointed out the obvious. You cannot repress a memory of an ancient mythic cult if you never possessed that memory in the first place. You can't lose something you never had. The trauma basement theory collapses entirely. The mind isn't just a blank slate. If a patient can hallucinate a 2,000-year-old symbol, there has to be something else down there in the dark. This realization caused a fundamental, irreversible rift. Jung concluded two massive things that Freud could not accept. First, that libido wasn't merely sexual energy. It was a generalized life force encompassing creativity, spirituality, and adaptation. And second, that beneath the trauma basement, there was a deeper layer. A layer far older and far more universal than any personal childhood memory. Freud thought Jung was diving off the deep end into mysticism. Jung thought Freud was blinding himself. Because Freud's map was too small, Jung had to draw an entirely new map of the mind. The sources lay out this architecture beautifully. Jung divided the psyche into three distinct layers. The first is the ego, what you and I think of as I, the conscious mind, the center of our everyday awareness. Modern neurotheology suggests the ego is a specialized organ. Think of it this way. The ego is the captain of a ship, standing on deck, looking through the spyglass, making decisions about where to steer, and completely arrogantly convinced they are the one running the whole show. But right beneath that deck, out of the captain's sight, is the second layer, the personal unconscious. This is the cargo hold where we store forgotten, subliminal, or repressed personal experiences. This is where our personal baggage lives. But the sources don't describe this as a quiet storage locker. They use a very specific term, feeling-toned complexes. In everyday language, we say someone has a complex. A complex is a web of associations, and they are not dead files. Jung observed that complexes behave like autonomous personalities, independent entities living inside you. They can grab the steering wheel right out of the captain's hands. Here's a real-world example. Imagine you have a deeply ingrained inferiority complex stemming from childhood. Then a colleague makes a slightly ambiguous comment. Instantly, your heart rate spikes, your vision tunnels, and you explode in a rage that completely baffles everyone in the room. Afterward, you say things like, "I don't know what came over me," or "I wasn't myself," because you literally weren't yourself. The complex was triggered. It intruded on consciousness. It taken over, altered your perception so that the colleague looked like an existential threat and drove your behavior toward a completely disproportionate reaction. That is deeply unsettling, but it still fits within the realm of personal experience. It's the cargo hold of one specific ship. Beneath that, though, is the third layer, the big one, the collective unconscious. If the ego is the captain and the personal unconscious is the cargo hold, the collective unconscious is the ocean itself. We are all sailing on the exact same water, subject to the exact same deep-sea currents. And here is what makes that so staggering. The collective unconscious is inborn. It does not derive from personal experience. You do not acquire it during your lifetime. Jung stated explicitly that it is identical in all humans, constituting, in his words, a common psychic substrate of a superpersonal nature. Take a moment to appreciate the full weight of that claim. Inheriting a physical brain structure is one thing. We all have an amygdala. That's just biology. But inheriting the contents of a mind, inheriting psychological material from ancestors you've never met, that sounds like magic, and it triggered massive resistance from the scientific community. But Jung defended it using a remarkably grounded biological argument. He said that assuming the collective unconscious exists is no more daring than assuming there are instincts. Think about that. We readily accept that a sea turtle hatches on a beach and instinctively knows to crawl toward the ocean. We accept that birds build incredibly complex nests without ever taking a class or watching a tutorial. We call that biological instinct, and nobody calls it magic. So Jung essentially asked, why do we accept that physical behavior is shaped by inherited instincts, but completely reject the idea that human perception, emotion, and imagination are shaped by inborn universal elements? If the body inherits biological hardware to survive, why wouldn't the mind inherit psychological hardware to make sense of the world? And this is where modern evolutionary neurotheology provides incredible validation for Jung. As human civilization developed, the collective unconscious wasn't some mystical cloud added on later. It evolved right alongside our physical bodies. Our brains developed specialized neural pathways, pattern detection systems to process threats, social hierarchies, and reproduction. The collective unconscious is essentially the phylogenetic history of our species, encoded directly into our neurobiology. We are inheriting the psychological survival strategies of every human being who lived before us. So if the collective unconscious is the ocean, what exactly is swimming down there? What are these inherited strategies? They are the archetypes. And this is where roughly 90% of internet summaries get it completely and utterly wrong. The most pervasive misconception is that an archetype is an inherited image, a picture hardwired into your head. People think Jung meant we are born with a literal picture of a wise old man with a beard or a fire-breathing dragon encoded into our DNA. That is false, entirely false. Jung was adamant, especially as his theory matured, that archetypes are not images, they are not inherited ideas. So what are they? Jung defines them as forms without content. He used the Latin phrase facultas praefamandi, a possibility of representation given a priori before you have any experience in the world. The mold is already there. They are invisible, unconscious, organizing patterns. Jung uses a specific analogy in the text that makes this abstract concept click into place. He talks about crystals. An archetype, he says, is like the invisible axial system of a crystal inside a liquid solution. When you have a liquid solution about to crystallize, there is an invisible geometric axis, essentially a magnetic field, determining how the molecules will aggregate. That axis has no material existence. You cannot put it under a microscope and see it, but the moment the physical conditions are right, the molecules build themselves along that exact invisible framework. And the specific crystal that eventually forms might be massive or tiny, tinted blue by local minerals or perfectly clear. The outward appearance shifts based on the environment, but the underlying geometric axis, the invisible mold, is invariable. It never changes. Connect that back to human psychology and the mechanism becomes clear. We are not inheriting a picture of a hero in our DNA. We are inheriting the empty mold, the magnetic field of the hero, and our specific culture simply pours its own local wax into that mold. The archetype itself is strictly unconscious and entirely empty. It only becomes an archetypal image when it reaches the conscious mind and takes on the cultural clothing of the individual experiencing it. So the invisible magnetic field is the hero archetype. But when it crystallizes in the real world, in consciousness, it looks like Jesus of Nazareth. It looks like Luke Skywalker. It looks like Harry Potter or Gilgamesh. The clothing changes based on the era and the geography, but the skeletal structure underneath is identical, because it is aggregating around the exact same human instinct. And this is where evolutionary neurotheology brings in a fascinating point about human ancestry. If archetypes are structural to the human species, they arise with the species itself. The evidence suggests that Neanderthals buried their dead with deliberate ritual practices, using red ochre pigments, arranging bodies intentionally, which implies they weren't simply disposing of a corpse. They were engaging in a rudimentary symbolic life. They were already operating with what we might call proto-archetypes, early versions, instinctual universal representations of death, of the mother, of the group. The biological hardware for pattern detection and meaning-making was already generating these forms in the minds of ancient hominids. The archetypes are the echoes of millions of years of human survival, still vibrating in our minds today. Now that we know what these invisible molds are and the evolutionary mechanism behind them, it's time to pull them out of the dark. We need to look at the specific figures that populate the collective unconscious, the inner pantheon, because according to Jung, these are the forces secretly dictating our daily behavior. Jung mapped dozens of archetypal patterns, but there are major pillars we have to cover. And we must start with the one closest to the ego, the one you encounter first, arguably the most dangerous to ignore, the shadow. Even just saying it sounds ominous, and it should. The shadow is the dark half of the personality, but dark doesn't necessarily mean purely evil. It means obscured from the light of consciousness. The shadow comprises all the traits, qualities, desires, and instincts that the conscious ego rejects, represses, or flat out refuses to acknowledge about itself. If you consciously identify as a highly rational, polite, generous, pacifist person, then your shadow contains your repressed aggression, your selfishness, your irrationality, and your cruelty. Because society demands that we behave in a certain civilized manner, we amputate parts of our primal nature and shove them down into the personal unconscious. But the shadow also has a deeper collective archetypal core, representing the absolute primitive, animalistic aspects of humanity as a whole. Now, if we've shoved it into the dark, how do we even know it's there? How does the shadow actually manifest in our daily lives? In dreams, the unconscious compensates for the conscious mind. So if you are overly polite in waking life, your shadow will appear in dreams as a hostile stranger, a violent trickster, or a hunter chasing you. And crucially, in Jungian analysis, the shadow almost always appears as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer. It is the literal dark mirror of yourself. But the shadow doesn't stay in our dreams. This is where it becomes a massive societal problem. Because the conscious ego cannot tolerate seeing these negative traits in itself, it employs a defense mechanism called projection. We throw that word around loosely in pop culture, oh, you're just projecting. But Jung means something very literal and neurological here. The brain's threat detection system is designed to identify external threats. It is very bad at handling internal psychological contradictions. It wants the threat to be outside. So when the pressure of the repressed shadow becomes too great, the mind literally takes that internal darkness and casts it onto the face of someone else. You perceive the threat as external. Here's a modern example. Think about someone who is chronically, pathologically obsessed with pointing out everyone else's vanity, constantly enraged by how selfish and image-obsessed other people are, posting about it, complaining about it endlessly. A Jungian analyst would say that person is completely blind to their own massive vanity. They are projecting their own unacknowledged narcissism onto co-workers, onto celebrities, onto strangers. They literally cannot see it in themselves, so the brain forces them to fight it in the external world. And this scales up terrifyingly. Jung notes that the projection of the shadow is the fundamental psychological basis for tribalism, prejudice, and the scapegoating of outgroups. When a society represses its collective aggression, it takes its collective shadow and casts it onto a neighboring country or a marginalized community. We literally see our own capacity for evil pasted onto them. So what happens if an individual simply refuses to look at their shadow, if they spend their whole life insisting they are purely good? Repression leads to possession. The shadow wants to be integrated. It is a biological drive toward wholeness. Deny it, and it operates autonomously behind your back. Jung captured this with a cutting observation. A man possessed by his shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into his own traps. If there is no doorstep for him to stumble over, he manufactures one for himself, and then fondly believes he has done something useful. The mechanism is self-sabotage. If you won't acknowledge your own destructiveness, your unconscious will hijack your behavior to destroy your career, your marriage, your most important relationships, just to prove to the ego that it is not in control. Integrating the shadow is what Jung calls the apprentice piece of psychological development. It is the first agonizing step toward actual maturity. But if the shadow is the apprentice piece, the sources tell us the masterpiece is the encounter with the next layer of archetypes, the anima and the animus. This is perhaps Jung's most complex and most misunderstood concept. So let's start with the biological foundation. Biologically, every human fetus begins with the potential for both sexes. We all carry a mix of masculine and feminine chromosomes and hormones. Psychologically, Jung argues we mirror this duality. We carry a contrasexual inner figure in our unconscious. For a man who consciously identifies with masculine traits, the unconscious compensates by housing an archetypal feminine figure called the anima. For a woman, the unconscious houses a masculine archetype called the animus. It's important to understand that he used masculine and feminine not as rigid social roles, but as symbolic energies. The masculine principle, logos, represented logic, structure, differentiation, and objective truth. The feminine principle, eros, represented feeling, connection, relationship, and synthesis. Jung argued that a whole human being must have access to both. So if a man hyperdevelops his logic and systematically ignores his emotional life, his anima remains primitive, infantile, and trapped in the unconscious. So what is the actual function of the anima and animus? What do? They are the bridge. They act as the mediator between the ego and the terrifying depths of the collective unconscious. In dreams, the anima often appears as a magical, numinous feminine being, a mermaid, a siren, a goddess, a wise guide. The animus might appear as a council of judging men, an eagle, a wandering father figure, or a hero. But just like the shadow, these archetypes don't stay in our dreams. We project them into the real world, and this is where human relationships get incredibly messy. This is, in fact, the root of almost all overwhelming, irrational, magical romantic infatuations. When you experience love at first sight that feels like a divine mandate, like fate itself is commanding you toward this person, Jung would argue you haven't actually seen the real human being standing in front of you. What you've done is project your internal anima or animus onto them. You have pasted the face of your inner god or goddess directly over their face. You aren't falling in love with them. You are falling in love with a piece of your own unconscious that you've attached to them like a sticky note, and this places an impossible, crushing burden on the real human partner, because eventually the projection fades. The real person makes a mistake, gets sick, shows a flaw, and the illusion shatters. The sources offer a clinical example of what happens when a person is completely possessed by this archetype. Jung writes about a highly respected, deeply rational European professor in his 70s. A man who has lived his entire life by the book. Then suddenly, he abandons his wife, ruins his academic reputation, and runs off with a young red-headed actress. And Jung writes, "We know that the gods have claimed another victim. That is the ultimate example of possession." This professor spent 70 years overdeveloping his rational ego, completely ignoring his feeling, irrational, instinctual side, his anima. And because he ignored her, she didn't mature. She remained wild and primitive. Eventually, the pressure in the unconscious became too great. The archetype erupted, possessed his ego, and projected itself so violently onto this young actress that he destroyed his entire life for a mirage. It is a psychological hostile takeover. Jung noted that when a man is possessed by his anima, he loses his rationality and becomes moody, touchy, vain, and hypersensitive. Conversely, when a woman is possessed by her animus, she loses her capacity for connection and becomes rigidly dogmatic, argumentative, harping on principles, laying down the law. In both cases, the archetype has seized the steering wheel and the person becomes a caricature of themselves. So we have the shadow holding our darkness and the anima animus holding our contrasexual inner image. Who else is swimming in this deep ocean? We encounter the archetypes of spirit and matter, the wise old man and the great mother. Let's start with the great mother. This is an archetype that appears universal across literally every culture on earth, and that universality makes perfect sense. Every human being is born of a mother. The archetype of the great mother is profoundly ambivalent. She has two faces. The light side is the life-giving, protective mother, and the dark side is the devouring mother. In myths, this is the witch in the woods, the dragon hoarding gold, the deep ocean that drowns sailors. Clinically, if a person is caught in a negative mother complex, they are often paralyzed. The devouring mother archetype suffocates independence. A modern parallel would be extreme helicopter parenting, where a parent removes every obstacle. but psychologically, it is the devouring mother preventing individuation. The counterweight to the great mother is the wise old man. He represents meaning, insight, and the spirit. He appears when the conscious ego is lost. This is every mentor figure in the history of storytelling. Gandalf, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Dumbledore. They all show up when the hero is at their lowest point. Jung describes the wise old man with a fascinating paradox. He is smaller than small and bigger than big. When the archetype first activates, it seems tiny. It's just a whisper of intuition, a fleeting thought, smaller than a thumb, yet its power to alter the entire trajectory of a human life is absolute. But not all archetypes are so dignified and profound. We also have to talk about the trickster, because this one is incredibly relevant to daily life. The trickster is essentially a collective shadow figure. You see him in mythology everywhere, Loki in Norse myth, Coyote in Native American traditions. But Jung insists the trickster isn't just an ancient campfire story. He says the trickster is highly active in modern rational people. The trickster represents counter-tendencies in the unconscious. His primary function is to shatter rigid, inflated consciousness. And he does it through what Jung hilariously calls the mischievousness of the object, those moments when you feel yourself at the mercy of annoying accidents. We call it a jinx, a clumsy moment, or accidentally hitting reply all on a catastrophic email. When your ego gets too inflated, the trickster arrives to humiliate you. He drags you crashing back down to earth to remind the captain that they do not control the ocean. He is the ultimate psychological reality check. And then there is the child and the hero archetype. The child archetype is a symbol of transformation, and it carries a beautiful paradox. It represents both the very beginning and the ultimate end. When a baby appears in a dream, it rarely means the dreamer wants children. It usually appears when the psyche is attempting to heal itself. The hero's journey isn't just an external adventure about slaying physical dragons. It is the internal map of human consciousness, ultimately to win the treasure, and that treasure is self-knowledge. Now, the sources issue a massive warning here, a very severe one. These archetypes are not just quirky personality traits. They carry a terrifying psychological weight. Jung uses a specific term to describe the energetic charge of an archetype, the numinous. In psychology, the numinous is an awe-triggering, dangerous, magical charge. When an archetype is activated, it bypasses your logic center and hits the limbic system directly. It comes with a feeling of overwhelming power, terror, and a sense of destiny. And this is where the extreme danger lies. If we don't realize these forces exist, we are at risk of identifying with them. Jung calls this possession. Jung uses a brilliant and terrifying mythological analogy for possession. He talks about the Nessus shirt. The moment he puts it on, it fuses to his skin. The poison burns him alive. The mask fuses to the skin. The archetype burns you alive from the inside out, because a fragile human ego cannot hold the high-voltage electrical charge of a god. But if individual possession destroys a life, collective possession destroys the world. Here we need to be explicitly clear. What follows is Jung's clinical psychological analysis of mass emotion and historical catastrophe. We are objectively examining his framework for how the human mind operates under extreme stress, without endorsing any political viewpoint whatsoever. Jung lived through the lead-up to World War II. He watched modern, hyper-rational European nations suddenly swept up in what he could only describe as a mass psychological contagion. He watched an entire civilization revive an archaic symbol, the swastika, which is an ancient collective mandala archetype. He didn't view the rise of totalitarianism as merely a political or economic movement. He viewed it as a literal eruption of the collective unconscious. So what is the mechanism behind mass psychosis from a Jungian perspective? When millions of individuals fail to do the inner work, when they fail to integrate their personal shadows, those repressed dark elements don't simply disappear. They combine, they form a massive volatile collective shadow. And because the shadow must always be projected outward, this collective darkness gets cast onto marginalized groups, minorities, or neighboring nations. The society literally sees its own repressed darkness, its own capacity for evil, pasted onto the faces of innocent people, and then attempts to destroy them, believing it is fighting evil, when it is actually fighting its own mirror reflection. And because this mass projection is fueled by archetypal energy, it carries that numinous charge. It sweeps away logic entirely. Rational people suddenly support atrocities because they are under the domination of the archetype. Jung warned about this explicitly. He wrote that private neuroses are a fiction today. What we are dealing with are social phenomena. The eruption of the archaic, primitive human being who is alive in us to a degree we have never fully reckoned with. Which brings us to a genuinely terrifying question. If modern society has essentially killed its gods, if we have dismantled our religious structures and myths with pure scientific rationalism, are we actually more vulnerable to being swallowed by these invisible forces? Jung said unequivocally, yes. In an age that possessed living symbols, like the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages or indigenous tribal rituals, the terrifying life of the collective unconscious was channeled into dogmatic archetypal ideas. The energy flowed like a well-controlled river inside the symbolism of the creed and the ritual. The physical statues, the stained glass windows, the incense, they protected the fragile human psyche. They gave the archetypes a place to live outside of us. We could visit the gods in the temple and then leave them there. They acted as a protective blast wall. But when pure rationalism broke down those walls, the images crumbled. We decided we were too smart for useless idols. And here is our fatal error. We didn't destroy the archetypes. We only destroyed our defense mechanisms against them. We expelled them from the cosmic space and drove them back into our own unprotected psyches. Heaven became the empty vacuum of physicists. But the secret unrest still gnaws at the roots of our being. The gods went underground, and now they erupt as political extremism, mass hysteria, and neurosis. We can't ignore the archetypes or they project onto our neighbors and start wars. We can't identify with them or they possess us and burn us alive like the Nessus shirt. And we can't scientifically banish them because they are literally the biological hardware of our brains. So what exactly is the solution? What are we supposed to do with them? This brings us to the ultimate culmination of Jung's entire theory, the point that most summaries completely skip over. The goal is individuation. Individuation is the lifelong, difficult, natural course of synthesizing the conscious and unconscious halves of the mind. It is the process of moving the center of gravity of your personality away from the ego and toward a new center called the self, with a capital S. If the ego is the captain of the conscious ship, the self is the entire ocean, the ship, and the sky above it. The self is the superordinate personality. It embraces both the light and the dark, the conscious and the unconscious. Individuation is the journey of the ego slowly, painfully realizing it is not the king, but rather an emissary of a far greater totality. Individuation isn't about defeating your inner demons like a knight slaying a dragon. It's about giving them a seat at the table so they don't burn the house down from the outside. Wholeness, not perfection, is the goal. Perfection is an illusion of the ego. Wholeness requires acknowledging your inner darkness. You must integrate the shadow. Then you must integrate the anima or animus. You have to come to the deeply uncomfortable realization that the gods and demons you are fighting or falling desperately in love with out in the external world are actually operating inside you. But how do you actually do that? You can't simply sit down, think really hard, and rationally integrate a numinous biological archetype. Jung is clear on this. It is no use at all to learn a list of archetypes by heart. They are complexes of experience that come upon us like fate. To integrate them, you have to engage with them through their native language symbols and images. This is where his methods of dream analysis and active imagination become essential. The clinical case study from the structural dream analysis source illustrates the psychological progression of individuation beautifully. In this study, we track a dreamer undergoing a long series of dreams over the course of therapy. At the beginning of the process, the dreamer's ego is confronted with shadow aspects that are violent, murderous, and destructive. And the conscious ego's first reaction in the dream is fear and flight. It runs, which is the default human setting. Suppress the dark thoughts, run from the monster. But as the therapy progresses and the patient pays genuine attention to the dreams, the shadow aspects begin to lose their lethal character. The ego stops running. Instead, it starts experiencing disgust and rejection toward these parts of the psyche. That is progress. It is turning around and facing the monster, even while hating what it sees. And because the ego held its ground, a new archetypal field activates. In a later dream, the dreamer encounters an infant needing care. In the image of this infant, the ego is meeting a pure, positive part of the psyche, the child archetype, pointing toward a new beginning, a new integration. But something crucial happens here. The ego realizes it lacks the means to care for this infant perfectly, and that realization is the humility required for individuation. The captain finally understands he doesn't have all the answers. By the end of the dream series, the dreamer's ego has become a willing participant in a mysterious process of death and renewal. The dreamer is no longer fighting the unconscious, they are collaborating with it, they have individuated a step further. But what happens when the psyche is too disoriented to even begin that process? What happens when a person is under such severe stress, the trauma of an impending divorce, or the onset of a schizophrenic break, that the ego is completely shattering? That is where we see the spontaneous, instinctual emergence of mandalas. Most people associate that word with Tibetan Buddhism, Hindu sand art, or psychedelic tapestries' circular geometric patterns. But Jung discovered something astonishing. His patients, including young children and Europeans with absolutely zero knowledge of Eastern religions or esoteric art, would spontaneously draw, paint, or dream of these exact same geometric circular quaternity symbols when they were in states of deep psychic dissociation. Quaternity meaning a structure divided into four. Why a circle divided into four? What is the brain actually doing? Neurologically and psychologically, the mandala is an archetype of order. When the conscious mind is overwhelmed by chaos, the unconscious instinctively generates a mandala as a biological attempt at self-healing. It is not a product of conscious reflection, it is an instinctual impulse. Nature imposes a severe concentric spatial pattern to compensate for the disorder and confusion. It constructs a central focal point to which everything is mathematically related. It is the mind throwing out an anchor in a hurricane, drawing a map of wholeness to remind the fractured ego of its center. It proves yet again that there is a transconscious disposition in every human being capable of producing the same healing symbols, at all times and in all places, strictly for the purpose of survival. Before we bring this all together, there is one concept that most summaries completely ignore because it makes modern scientists deeply uncomfortable. And that is Jung's concept of synchronicity, which is intimately tied to the numinous charge of the archetypes. Jung defined synchronicity as a causal connecting principle, meaningful coincidences, moments when an internal psychological state perfectly mirrors an external physical event without any direct mechanism linking them. The most famous example is the scarab beetle story. Jung is treating a highly rational, stubborn patient who has become completely blocked in her therapy. She is telling him a dream about being given a golden scarab piece of jewelry. As she speaks, Jung hears a tapping at his closed window. He opens it, reaches out, and catches the insect flying in a rose chafer, the closest European equivalent to a golden scarab. He hands it to her and says, "Here is your scarab." The shock of that coincidence shatters her rigid rationalism entirely and breaks her therapeutic blockage. For Jung, archetypes weren't just trapped inside the skull. As the mind and the physical universe evolved together, he suspected the archetypes might bridge the gap between matter and spirit. He called this the unus mundus, the unitary world. It's why his theories overlap so strangely with quantum physics, which he actually explored at length with the Nobel laureate physicist Wolfgang Pauli. It's also worth acknowledging what most summaries miss entirely: Jung's own ambivalence. He didn't write this as infallible dogma. He constantly revised his theories. He struggled with the criticism of universality versus cultural specificity. But what is remarkable is how modern evolutionary psychology has essentially taken Jung's core premise and stripped it of the mystical language. When a modern neuroscientist talks about innate releasing mechanisms, they are describing the exact same biological software. Hardwired threat detection algorithms, or kin selection, they are describing the exact same biological software that Jung mapped a century ago and called the shadow, the great mother, and the hero. So let's pull all of this together. We have just taken a massive journey into the deepest, darkest, and most ancient waters of the human mind. And the core truth of Jung's work is this: you are an ancient being. You carry the entire phylogenetic history of the human species, the triumphs, the terrors, the survival instincts of millions of years encoded not just in your bones, but in the invisible architecture of your mind. Carl Jung mapped that architecture. He named the deep sea currents. The archetypes are the software of your soul. The shadow, the anima, the wise old man, the trickster, they are not fables. They are the psychological organs of your mind, and they are running right now whether you are aware of them or not. If you ignore them, they project outward. You will scapegoat your neighbors, sabotage your relationships, and stumble into traps of your own making, completely blind to the fact that you built them yourself. If you identify with them, they possess us, inflating your ego until it bursts and burns you alive. The only way out is through individuation. You have to acknowledge the darkness as your own. You have to integrate the terrifying, numinous depths of the collective unconscious into your conscious life. You have to give the monsters a seat at the table, because if you don't, they will run your life from the shadows, and you will call it fate. So let's turn the lens directly onto you. We've talked about the architecture of the mind, the invisible molds, and the danger of possession. But this isn't abstract theory. This is operating in your brain right now, today. Ask yourself which archetype is running you right now. Look closely at your life. Look at the destructive patterns you keep repeating. And most importantly, which archetypes have you locked in the basement? Because if you genuinely believe you are a perfectly rational, logical person in total control of your life, what exactly is your shadow doing when you aren't looking? Are you caught by the trickster, constantly tripping over your own carefully laid plans? Are you living inside the devouring mother, suffocating the people you love under the weight of your protection? And most importantly, which archetypes have you locked in the basement? Because if you genuinely believe you are a perfectly rational, logical person in total control of your life, what exactly is your shadow doing when you aren't looking? That is not a comfortable question, but it may be the most important one you ever ask yourself. Because if you aren't looking at the monsters in the dark, they are absolutely looking at you. Thank you for going on this journey today. Keep questioning the world. Keep questioning your certainties. And most importantly, keep questioning your own mind. We'll see you next time.